Hey, friends. Good seeing you again here on a Wednesday afternoon chat with Jonathan and Steve. And so we thought that we would take some time today to just kind of have a conversation about fear and about dealing with fear. And not surprisingly, that is a topic that we hear a lot about these days. And not only a topic that we hear a lot about, but that a lot of us are feeling and a lot of us are trying to process and also help others figure out as well, people that we might be in close community with, and how do we help walk other people through that, whether that's kids or friends or um, older parents or any of that. There's just a wide range of that. And so yeah, so I we just Steve and I, in terms of things we want to talk about that were relevant, and said, okay, well, let's just have a conversation about that. um, that's what we're going to chat about today. So Steve, with that, let's yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts when we say, okay, let's talk about fear, but where the baseline of that
Let's talk
starts.
about fear, baby.
Mm, mm,
What?
mm,
I'm
mm,
sorry, I
mm,
sang over
mm.
you.
That's all right. Um,
Yeah, are you getting? I'm hearing a lot of people talking about fear, for sure.
yeah,
There's getting emails and on calls, like lots a genuine sense of unease in people who are surprised to have that sense of unease,
yeah,
all the way to really afraid.
yeah.
I'm not.
Well, of course,
I
no,
don't have any fear because my faith is too great for that. But a lot of other people I notice.
yes. So for everyone else, yeah, let's talk about
Huh?
them and maybe, yeah, just I think what we're always trying to figure out is how do we get it back to the beginning of the conversation, and what are the things that we need to build the foundation, the conversation on. And so where would you
Mhm.
start us off there and feel like, okay, here's the foundation of the conversation we have to establish?
I think that's a great way of putting it. I would say one, I made a joke because I wanted to say the exact opposite of what's true. And that is faith and fear. The reason we're people of faith is because we feel fear. It's not to not feel fear. And the faith goes alongside with a lot of other thoughts and feelings too, but fear is one of them. If you don't have anything to be afraid of, then you don't have anything to be faithful about. Uh, generally speaking, I think. So I'll say that, but I'll also say in my experience with it personally, and then just in what I slash we do, fear is an emotion, and so it's part of the design, and therefore it can't be bad. It can't be bad. Fear is why probably a lot of people listening to this um, are alive, directly or indirectly. They either felt fear and made decisions because of that fear, and that's why they're alive now, or their ancestors did at one point. Um, Fear got you out of an unsafe situation, or maybe made you avoid it altogether. Um, I mean, fear got us through the Pleistocene. We were well designed to make it through really difficult circumstances for a long time. I see fear as a smoke detector, and so uh, we all have this smoke detector. And the reason that's important is because if you wait until there's fire, because your body you can sense fire too. um, that's too late. A smoke detector is a super healthy way of saying, before this gets to a place where you're not going to have any choices left, act. And so that's what fear is. Fear is a smoke detector. And I think the issue in answering your what's the baseline is not that fear is bad. Yeah, the issue and the basis for so much spiritual practice and mindfulness and counseling and for us as people of faith, um, our, our smoke detectors are set too high, and that they're on too high of a setting. And I would say most, if not all of us, can identify with some part of that. They're they're set too high. Um, and so I've, for most of my adult life, come to recognize that this is true, working through coming to see that there's no, you can't, I'm going to push this metaphor way too far. You can't take the batteries out. Fear is part of the design. And some of us have early on in our life, we've adopted some certain habits about fear that stay with us. So you're coming to recognize it, coming to recognize you can't just get rid of it. But I can learn the difference with time and patience and discipline. I can tell the difference between the smoke alarm telling me that there's actually fire, very rarely the case, or the difference between that and just chirps and or beeps, and those are going to happen for the rest of my life. I anticipate chirps and beeps the rest of my life, and I'm learning the difference. That's not fire. That's just the particular model of my smoke detector. So, I think that I think that probably speaks to a lot of us of just affirming your fear is good. It's just can you learn how to interpret what your smoke detector is telling you.
Yeah, I think there's an author, psychologist, who wrote a book called Emotional Agility, which is a really good book to check out if anyone's interested in books to read right now. But talks about that it's data, that emotions are all data, and that somewhere along the line we've gotten in the habit of assigning certain emotions as positive emotions and certain emotions as negative emotions versus them being neutral. That there's not good emotions and bad emotions, there's emotions. And fear is one of those. But what we tend to associate with fear is that it's bad and that it's negative and should be
Mm-hmm.
avoided at all cost. And so therefore we have a really twisted view of just our emotional health because it's part of ourselves that we shut down. It's part of ourselves that we don't pay attention to. But when it's data, it's like, oh, that should help me pay attention to something. That should help me see something. I need to observe it. As you're saying, what's that chirping sound? Um, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so many of us, we just grown up being told, especially in any sort of faith context, that fear is a very terrible, bad thing. And I don't think that's the way it's
Yeah,
presented, but that's how we've been told.
yeah. As a counter of faith. I heard became my mantra for a while. I kind of let go of it in the last few months, but I should come back to it. But if you think about emotion as information rather than instructions, a lot of us were taught that whatever you're feeling is instructing the next thing that comes out of your mouth. Whatever you're feeling instructs where you have to put your body, what you have to do with it. And the stronger that feeling, the more strict and intense those instructions. I feel anger, and therefore that instructs me to be angry with you and to do to you whatever these I interpret these instructions to do. But the switch that can happen. Well, I made it sound like that's a day. It is not. But what you're switching in your head is to say, I still feel this, and I still observe its intensity, but that's data. I drive the car, not the lights on the dashboard. The lights on the dashboard are telling me something about the engine, but that does not tell me to turn right. I tell it that. And so just recognizing the agency and control that you have in that, again, it doesn't happen just because, you can't write it on the calendar and everything's different. You have to come to observe that. But yeah, to your other point, so many of us have grown up thinking that fear runs counter to courage, and fear runs counter to faith, and fear runs counter to all the things that we look up to in heroes. And I'm really late to the party. I don't know about you, but all of the people that I look up to are afraid. Sometimes generally, but at least frequently. And then it's just a matter of how much. But I as a kid, I thought heroes and strength was mitigated or eliminated fear, and it's just not true. And I don't mean to insult the intelligence of anybody listening to that. I'm admitting I'm late to the party, but you might actually hold every time I feel afraid. That's a thing to hide, and then in its place, I have to perform courage. Courage is fear. If you don't have fear, there's no need for courage. And so it's part of the design. It's a light on your dashboard, and recognizing that is so empowering, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, then let's wrestle with that. If fear itself isn't the issue, um, that it's something that's just part of the design, it's part of the way things are, it's data, it's emotion, it's neither good nor bad. Um, so then what then becomes the issue? Um, if it's not just fear itself, um, how does what becomes the issue then where that gets toxic, difficult?
Mhm. Well, I'd love to hear you respond to that too, because I know you and I have learned a lot of this together, and then in our own, I was going to say our own corners, which I guess would make us opponents in a boxing match. But yeah, we've in tandem and apart, we've both learned a lot about this over the years. Um, I think so. You know, when you talk about, I made mention earlier of fear got us here. Fear is a mechanism by which we've survived some things. I think if we don't recognize that it's information versus it's not instruction, it's information. If we don't recognize that it's an internal, that fear is an alert, then it sort of becomes the basis for how we understand our environment. And I know for me, and we talk about this a lot. I'm trying on the fly to make this. I'm trying to find a new vocabulary in case anybody's heard me talk or teach or write about this or anything. But I'll just say it how it normally comes to me. It feels smart to be afraid, and it doesn't. You don't feel trembly necessarily when you feel afraid, but it feels intelligent to be anxious. Or conversely, it feels stupid and unnecessarily vulnerable or naive or childish or whatever to not be vigilant, to not be on alert. And some of us have a really good reason for that. And I affirm that. Some of us have been through hell and back. And to tell that person, hey, it's just data. There are people listening to this, I would assume, or people very dear to me who would say, no, it's a strategy that is why I'm able to be alive in this moment. So again, I really I think that that's valid. But many of us, it's just been a protracted sense of not knowing the difference between feelings and um, the determiner of our speech and our habits and decisions and indecisions. And so, if it becomes toxic, and I think maybe even that word would be interesting to discuss. But I think it's when it sort of becomes the way that we decide to do things and decide what's what has value. And if if we don't learn to allow it to be a tool to serve us, then we serve it. And I'm not just trying to be poetic with that. I've spent a lot of my life serving my own fears. And you could look at it and say, oh, he's just being self-deprecating. Oh, he's just a little insecure. No, I have my fists up. You just can't, not my literal ones. I am already prepared to defeat you because my fear has taught me all encounter has a winner and a loser. And I don't want to be the latter. Um, I can assume the worst and feel smart about that so that I can't be taken advantage of. But that's vigilance. That's an unprocessed trauma where I'm impossible to work with because I refuse to be vulnerable. I refuse to be seen. So it's all an act. It's all a show. You can never get to me. You could call that toxic, but it's toxic for me. It's not just the effect I'm having on other people. It's toxic for me too, because I'm living in a war zone that only exists in my head right now. Even if historically, I have a reason to believe that this was the best way. Many of us do. I am creating a war zone that doesn't exist outside my skull. And that costs me closeness and peace, costs me relationships, and it's probably wearing out and hurting other people as well.
Yeah.
That's a pretty general answer. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think to um, with what you said there, that it did become for lots of people a mechanism by which to survive, and that fear for many people has become, yeah, this was a way of life in order to survive a particular situation.
Yeah.
I think what we have to wake up to is not to beat ourselves up over that, but to say
Hmm.
that served me in that season of life and it was really necessary to live that way. But that doesn't mean that what got me here is how I need to move forward. And that's,
Yeah.
I think, that inner work that we have to do in awareness to say, oh, these are patterns that I've developed based on wounds or experiences or circumstances or individuals, um, that caused me to survive by fear. But moving forward, I need a new tool set, and I need to figure out new patterns because I'm just caught up in living in the same way all the time. To your metaphor
Mm.
there, that I'm living in a war zone constantly, and that was necessary for a while, but it's not necessary now. But
Yeah.
I'm living like it still is. So I think those are, um, yeah, since how I think about it, and like you had mentioned, um, even how loud it gets turned up, the smoke detector. It becomes the dial of it, and it's the volume of fear, and it's how much we let that consume us. And I think one of the things, we've talked about before and we've shared publicly, but just to what happens in the brain with fear, and having an awareness and understanding of why it feels so all consuming. There's this lower two-thirds of our brain, which is that fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain, and it processes information at an incredibly high rate. I think it's 4 billion bytes per second is kind of the actual speed in which that part of our brain processes information. But if we just put that in more relative terms, let's say if you divide it all out and did the math, it's like 4,000 miles per hour that fear and negativity and that fight or flight response in that lower two-thirds of our brain processes. And so it rushes through us and feels all consuming and feels like it's in control. But that top one-third of our brain, that prefrontal cortex, that processes meaning and significance and joy and beauty and wonder, it processes information comparably at 2 miles per hour. So we've got 4,000 miles per hour, with this fear, flight, um, freeze kind of response, and 2 miles an hour for joy, wisdom, beauty. And so that,
It's the difference between a bullet and writing a poem.
absolutely. And so when you think about the implications of that, we are living in this world right now where anything we can consume can, from a internet, from the TV, social media, any news conference, anytime you turn on the news, we're reminded of, especially in this situation we are in, of why you should be
Mhm.
afraid. And that is just processing so fast in all of us. Um,
Yeah.
but it takes a lot of discipline to say, I'm going to slow down and really try to focus and meditate on these other things, on gratefulness and on the beauty that is going on in my life, things that I can be grateful for. Um, and because it processes so much slower, it gets lost in the consumption of
Hmm.
fear. But it's a physiological, very physical neuro thing that's happening with us. And once we can become aware of that, we go, oh, that's what's happening in me. What I feel like is consuming me right now. Oh, this is what the brain does, and
Yep.
we can see it for what it is.
Yeah. And it feels so real. And some of us are so good at it going quickly. I mean, this is the culture that originated the phrase, I think you never get a second chance to make a first impression. There's a reason we make first impressions so quickly. And that's because it's really safe to make up your mind quickly about things, especially people. I mean, if you leave a decision unmade, you're leaving yourself vulnerable. So the reason we form judgments and impressions so quickly. Now you could be a billionaire CEO and be lauded for this. Oh, he just knows people so well. Fear, anxiety, all the way up to like a paranoia is sort of how we do that. Just some of us are really good at it, so it doesn't seem like something we need to heal from. But what that does is it shuts you off of reality. And so I think that's one of the tricky things of maybe developing and becoming deeper is it's asking successful people sometimes slow down and disbelieve this thing that has gotten you to this point a little bit. I know it got you through the Pleistocene. I know it was valuable when when there were only four of us and we had to take down a woolly mammoth. But I'm telling you, if you want to get to this next deeper place, to step back from what's felt so successful into something that you would have maybe looked down on yesterday? Why are you taking your time? Why are you rethinking your thoughts? Why are you compassionately skeptical with your own snap judgments about everything? Well, the reason is because you're not actually in a war zone, and there's really nothing um, essentially inherently admirable about making up your mind quickly. And so I think also one of the things that's helped me, because that certainly describes who I thought I was trying to be. Um, this seems a little self-important, but just I like to be witty and clever, and I like to hang out with witty and clever people. And sometimes people will say, "Oh, that was a witty thing that you said." A lot of that comes from trying to be quick on my feet because it's a survival tactic. And so one of the things that I've grown from a lot is what you're describing is understanding sort of how the machinery works. I'll just add to it. I mean, I'm not a neurosurgeon any more than you are, but when you think about like what we're doing right now and what's happening with viewers wherever they are, is all this information comes into your brain. The thalamus sort of regulates where it goes, and it goes to that neocortex, the higher beauty reasoning part of us. When we're afraid, when something happens, there's a lion in the room. That data doesn't just get sent to the neocortex; it gets sent to the fear center, the amygdala. And so we talk about that a lot. But an amygdala hijack is when this data cannot be reasoned about. I can't go slow and thoughtful because it got poured right into my fight, flight, or freeze center. And so that's why it feels so real. And that's why we can't judge it, is because it's not a decision to go, I could have been mature about this or spiritual, but instead I flew off the handle. That's because we have a habitual pattern. Our brain is actually sending that data to infantry, to our arsenal, and not to the poet, not to the scientist. And so you have to be gracious with that. When that happens, it doesn't necessarily always mean. Well, let me say it like this, because this is where I grew a lot from understanding. If that habitual pattern of here's data and it feels most intelligent and responsible to send that immediately to the fear center, this is why you're so easily offended. This is me speaking to all of us, the audience. This is why you get so easily offended. Bam. This is why you get so angry at being overcharged. This is why we get so hurt by other people's lack of consideration, their slights. This is why we get so frustrated when plans fall through. That data goes straight to this is something to attack, this is something to run from, or this is something to stare and hold still until the monster passes by. It goes straight to, how do I go into a survival mode? And so that's where it lives. It lives at that level day to day. And so we make jokes about laundry and the checkout at the grocery. That's where it lives. And so doing the work in that space of slowing down and having healthy, compassionate skepticism about how we normally process that information, it's been huge for me. Then you can contextualize and say that, one of my examples, what did I say? Yeah, you've been overcharged. They probably didn't mean to. There's a whole bunch of reasons this could have happened. Now I'm allowing the smart part of me to turn back on. So, and maybe we can get into some of those practices toward the end, but there's actual ways of doing that, to process the data, to take it a different path through your head.
Yeah, I think that's one of the way that's played out for me has just been my own therapist helped me kind of identify what he would call fear loops, where what I would be doing is I would be processing things. I'm trying to solve problems in my head that don't actually exist. And so I'm looking ahead, or I'm thinking, or I'm afraid of, what about this and what about that? And what if this happens? And what if this happens? And he just stopped me one day and was like, yeah, you're trying to solve problems in your head that don't exist, which is why you keep spinning out in fear. It feels like your wheels are constantly spinning because you're trying to solve problems that don't actually exist. You can't solve them. So it's this endless fear loop that you're caught up in.
Mm.
And that was so helpful for me to then start to recognize, oh, this is what fear is doing in me. But this is just an unknown. Like, okay, I don't know how to solve that yet. And that's an unknown. And we don't even know if I'm going to have to deal with that or process that later. And I don't even know if that's a reality. But getting to that point of also naming it and being really specific about it, because how fears worked in my life before is it can sit as like this big, dark, ambiguous cloud that sits over your head and it's all jumbled together. And to actually chase all that down and say, let's name what you're actually afraid of. Let's
Hmm.
name it, chase it down. Let's go there, and let's tease it all the way out so that I can look at it and stare at it and say, this is what I'm actually afraid of. Then I can deal with that. But as long as I just let that fear process in my head at 4,000 miles per hour, then it just becomes this all consuming feeling that I'm just walking around scared all the time. And then I'm trying to solve problems in my head that I can't really solve. And it's just this crazy loop. And but what you're describing is so important because it's that pause. It's that I've got to step out of that for a moment. I need to be able to look at it and name it. That's one of the things
Hmm.
you've been, I think, a phrase you've used through the years. That we don't love generally, that we love specifically. Um, and for me, that's been helpful even with fear, where it's not good to leave it general. It's you gotta, if you want to actually deal with it in a healthy way, you gotta get specific with it and you gotta name
Hmm.
it, because
Yeah.
leaving it general is this overhanging cloud. Um, just yeah, it wears you away. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering what you would
Yeah.
maybe say to as well, like from a faith conversation standpoint, because we hear that language a lot in the faith context, especially a part of the tradition that we're a part of. That hey, don't be afraid, and it says over
Hmm.
and over in the Bible, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. So, which I think lends toward more guilt when we do feel fear, because we feel like we're being disobedient, and we feel like us having that emotion that we're disappointing God, we're letting God down. As we've talked about that even earlier, that
Hmm.
it's opposite to faith, and so somehow if I admit that I'm fearful, I'm admitting that I don't have enough faith and I'm disobeying what God's told me to do 300 plus times in the scriptures. So, how I'm curious how you would tease out that to say, oh, okay, let's talk about that in the Bible when it says, do not fear over and over and over again from God.
Hmm.
How do we reconcile that with, oh, this is a normal part of life?
Um, well, I have two bodies of thought about this, and one is like I can imagine some people that I think it's important maybe to say at this point. I'm not sure if this fits exactly because I want to answer your question, but it occurs to me that some people can't understand other people's fears. Like you know what your fears are, but other people's fears don't make sense. Maybe you go so far as to say or seem less valid, but I think it's important to recognize, like even asking faith questions, it doesn't even occur to some people to have like existential theological fear faith because have they don't have a very high like self-survival fear, but their fear might be more social. They have more of an instinct about navigating social um, scenarios, like how am I going to fare with people? And but in some people, like all that they think about is, does what I do mean anything? Do I contribute anything to a world that needs somebody to contribute to? And so that it's like their own personal sense of, maybe that's existential, like this meaning. So so and I'm getting in a little bit to like instinctual variance is something I've been studying a lot more lately, and that we've talked about a little bit. But some people like it makes a lot of sense for them to panic over finances, and they can't understand why their spouse or their friend or their parents or their kids aren't also panicking over finances, especially right now. And wash your hands, and that like their face gets hot at the idea of not washing your hands the full 20 seconds. Other people are more worried about, they're just not as worried about that, but not because they're deficient. They have a different way of being afraid. And so that does affect, like, fear isn't one thing. It really is driven a lot by our circumstances and our personality. And I think it's important to understand that, because you might have two people in the same circumstances, both afraid, and they're afraid of different things. And if they got to explain it, they would look at each other like, what are you talking about? My wife and I, we feel this a lot. I don't have a self-survivor, like a survivalist instinct is very strong. I don't, and so that has the effect of, I don't really ever think about money, and I never really worry about my health. I don't sit around thinking about my physical health. But Christy, she thinks more about the finances and thinks about, hey, if we're doing this, then we can't do this. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably true. I hadn't thought about that. But for me, it's other things, more existential things that she looks at. She's like, oh, I'm not worried about that at all. I'm like, are you kidding me? If we don't do this, then what's the meaning of life? That level of stuff. So as we've come to understand that, it's made great conversation. Anyway, so that's kind of a long answer to a question you didn't ask, but that needs to be said in there somewhere when we talk about, well, what are we even saying? Should we be afraid of God, or afraid of what God does? Or should we be afraid? Kennedy said fear, being afraid of fear itself. The Bible does, yeah. I never counted it, but somebody said it was 365 do not be afraids in the Bible.
One for every day.
That can't, yeah, right. We're screwed on leap year, I guess.
That's what 2020 happened. That's what happened in 2020.
That's what happened. That one day we weren't properly fearful. It all went to where in a fanny pack. I think it would be sort of silly if those are, when the angels say it, or whoever's saying it to whoever in the Bible. I think it would be a really silly misunderstanding of human nature to say, do not feel fear, because that's like, many of us learned the hard way. Don't tell somebody to relax. There's nothing less relaxing than being told to relax. So it can't mean do not feel fear. I tend to think that it's saying, do not be consumed by it, or don't be caught up in its way. And what is fear's way? Self-prioritization, centralizing my own experience at the expense of others. This is my way. These are my interests. Me, 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 me. That's the way of fear. And I think other people in the Bible might have said that's the way of death. It's the self-prioritization, or the us prioritization at the expense of others. So do not be afraid, I take as, this is not a moment to protect yourself. So you might be, I think I would be a little unnerved and maybe a little loose in the bowel to be face to face with an angel. There's nothing, do not fear, that would change about how I felt. But I think the message would be, despite how you're feeling, this is not a moment to protect yourself. And so maybe it's worth noting that a central thesis of Christian belief is that God is not someone that we have to protect ourselves from. God is not trying to get us or take us down to destroy us. That's how sin is described. That's how the devil is, the crouching lion in the grass that just can't wait to tear us apart. Many of us, we grew up thinking that that's what God turns into if you cuss. That's who God is if you, dream about a girl that you're not married to. Don't be afraid, I think, is, God is like Jesus, and Jesus is not scary, even though he likes to destroy systems that are self-interested. He'll destroy those, but not the people. He loves the people, the system. He'll punch up at all day long until it punches back at him. And so that's maybe a whole other theological discussion. But for me, don't be afraid. And God being like Jesus is, God is reassuring us over and over, not something you have to get defensive about, run from, freeze, and hope God passes by and doesn't notice you. And Jesus is our reassurance about that. How do you take it? That's how I take it.
No, I would affirm that. I think that's really helpful insight, and it's important. And I think I grew up in a context of a faith community where I was that, oh yeah, you don't talk about fear and you don't show fear because, again, God keeps saying don't be afraid. And so if I do admit to being afraid, then I'm being disobedient. And man, I didn't want to do that. So, but where I was forced to face it was, here over, and I've talked publicly about this too, but over, the last few years, there came a moment a few years ago where my body kept telling me
Mm.
something was really wrong, even though mentally I was like, oh yeah, I'm not afraid of this, but my body started carrying a certain level of anxiety and fear and stress, panic attack feeling, I thought I was having a heart attack, all of that. And it was this disconnect from my brain to how I would process information and what I would allow myself to accept, that my body was carrying pain and stress and fear. And that forced me to have to learn to pay attention to that, which forced me to then have to be, oh, okay, I can deal with fear and I can confront it and not have to avoid it or put it in some other camp that it's being disobedient. For me to be a healthy person, I need to pay attention to what my body's saying. And I need to pay attention to my body is reacting in fear, even if I won't let my own framework or my own theology or my own belief system or the way that I want to present myself doesn't allow me to do that. My body's telling me something's wrong. And so I think that was really a pivotal moment for me, kind of in my own journey, to learn to pay attention to that. And so now, more than I pay attention to my brain, I pay attention to my body. I pay attention to, oh, there's that feeling, that tightness in the chest. There's that lightheadedness. There's there's something that I'm reacting to that I'm not even realizing it. And I need to now pause and pay attention to it and chase it down and do the work of getting to what is that fear and anxiety? How do I name it? How do I get it out of this dark, ambiguous cloud that I'm not even really paying attention to? Um, and just, yeah, chase it down. So
Hmm.
that's been important for me and helpful for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me in my context, I felt like, yeah, that was weakness. That was disobedience. And my body put me in a position to force me to have to deal with it. And
Hmm.
I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that and maybe somebody finds themselves doing that, where maybe whatever your body starts to feel it, you just pay attention to that. Someone had written
Hmm.
about, this cognitive behavioral therapy session, which a lot of this is, from a cognitive part, but a lot of it's also paying attention to our bodies and what our body's telling us. And there's a whole lot of physiology that's happening, if we'll just pay attention to it. So I'm wondering if you
Yeah.
could talk to us about some tools then to say, okay,
Mhm.
yeah, if it's fear isn't, um, yeah, if it's not something to dismiss, it's not something to just we're not being disobedient, um, but it's
It's not
there,
weak.
right? It's not weak, but it's this way of fear that's consuming,
Hmm.
that God's not telling us not to be afraid, but don't give in to that. Then what
Hmm.
are some tools that we manage day to day? Because that's just a reality we're all facing right now. Like it's
Yeah.
a constant, we got to deal with this. So what are some
Hmm.
new pathways and some new tools? Because if what got us here isn't going to get us to where we need to go, um, what are some new tools that we can embrace?
Yeah. I uh, lead a group on Wednesday mornings called Wake Up Man, and in the beginning, I said, "Show of hands," the Zoom screen. Show of hands, how many of you are noticing your mood swings and irritation? Not just week to week anymore, but like hour to hour, every single hand. I'm feeling that. And so, talking about those are the moments, these that we're inhabiting now, the strange time we're living in. These are the moments to actually take the time to implement the tools. It feels like we need to get back to spiritual practice and all that after the storm passes, and when we have the luxury of doing that. But right now, we got to figure out where we're going to buy toilet paper and how we're going to visit people we can't visit, and all the job and money stuff, all of that. This is the time to do it. So this is really simple. I'm giving something that it was taught to me, and it's something I'm still working on. As somebody that can become afraid and can become really angry, that gets better with age. If you're young and you're whatever young means, you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, and you feel like I still get super frustrated. I still fly off the handle. I still get really impatient with people and myself. Um, yeah, it's because that's fear. And one way or another, that's fear. And so these are ways to graciously heal and wake up to some of that. So I think we've already said some of them. So first, name the feeling. So when you would normally say, this is that moment, I'm just going to do my thing. I'm going to fight. Happens a lot, especially when we're all packed in together. Or flight. I'm just going to go hide from you, punish you with silence, or I just need to get out of here because I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. Or freeze. I'm physically present, but I'm just going to check out because I can't deal with this. All of those are reasonable in certain settings. To name it. What am I actually feeling right now? If this is information, not instructions, what is this? Don't name it quickly. Name it accurately if you can. What is this?
That's so important too, where we can go. I find men especially struggle with this, but everything comes out as anger. And it's, oh, I'm just
Or
angry all the time.
contempt.
Right. I'm just angry all the time and I don't understand why. And an emotional vocabulary can be low. Like it's one of these things where the simple discipline of, I've invited many couples and men to say, okay, let's create a list of words that you put up on a refrigerator door. Like, I'm embarrassed, I'm lonely, I feel disrespected, I feel unwanted, whatever it is. Like, then name it. Like, but it just comes out. Anger serves so many times as this ambiguous dark cloud that hangs over it, and you never get to, like, oh, let's deal with the fact that what I'm really feeling is I'm feeling embarrassed. I feel like a failure. And so I think it's really important to do that, to do the work of naming it. But we have to embrace that many of us don't have a very broad emotional vocabulary that we use very often.
Yeah.
So we don't have any tools in the toolbox to go and get. So it just comes out as, I'm angry. And everyone then just tiptoes around you all the time, and you're walking on eggshells, and you're just constantly living in this fear, but you can't name what's actually going on. So yeah, go to a thesaurus or go to a dictionary. Like, as silly as elementary as that may sound, but just Google list of fears and emotions, different ways to feel. Great. Put them on a wall so that you can point to it and force yourself to say, oh, that's what I'm feeling.
That'd be a funny thing to use in the moment. Like if you're in an argument and you just stop, go to the fridge and go, I feel invalidated. Sometimes also, I think it's probably worth saying the thing that you're feeling and you can't label is because the label is embarrassing, because you've been told, if I admit that I am feeling like maybe I don't have worth as a man or a woman, as a whatever, at work or school or something like that. And if I say I feel invalid, oh my gosh, I'll feel like such a pansy. It's a funny flower to pick on, by the way. I was thinking about that. That plant flowers even in ice.
Tulip.
That's a funny thing.
Just move to like tulip.
I feel like a tulip. Well, that feels Calvinist. But yeah, I feel so weak to have to admit that I'm invalid. So sometimes we actually have the vocabulary, but our daddies or our macho whoever or whatever, told us we can't use that word. So name the feeling, simultaneously count to 10, which I know sounds beneath us if we're going to be serious about spiritual practice. But counting to 10 actually gives your if you're an amygdala hijack of some kind, you're feeling really stressed out. That's about how long, maybe not as long, to get the cortisol back down, the adrenaline, the epinephrine back down to a level where your body comes down out of the fight or flight response. So for that hijack to start to dissipate, 6 to 10 seconds. So the old wisdom of count to 10 is actually really, really good science. So I'm naming this, and I'm not judging it. I want to find a name for it. And while I'm doing that, I'm just slowing myself down. I'm not going to jump to blame and shame like I normally do. I'm not going to erupt bodily, fight, flight, freeze. I'm going to name this, and I'm going to take 10 seconds. And so you can see that these aren't clear steps. Naming right into 10 seconds, counting to 10, nice and calm, and then breathing. And to take several deep breaths, it puts your brain back in a rest state. It reopens the neocortex, the part of us that can be reasonable. So we have full access to everything that we are, not just the weapons or the eject lever. Some deep breaths puts our mind and body back into sort of a rest reset. So name, 10 seconds, deep breaths. And here's one. This is new to me. I've only just for the last year been doing this. Sounds really strange. Always sounded strange to me. To thank the emotion. I know I'm going to lose some men on that one. It seems like women have an easier time with this. I've learned this from women. To thank the emotion, which feels crazy because you're talking to yourself. Everybody has multiple personalities. I hope you've learned that at this point. To thank that emotion is a non-judgmental way of acknowledging this was apparently at least felt necessary on some level. That probably has to do with childhood. Most of our adulthood is some sort of response from the few years of childhood. Thank you. See, to thank it, you see how I'm not condemning it. I'm not judging it. I'm not trying to hide it. I'm saying, I think you were trying to protect me. Thank you. However you want to word that, but use gratitude. To thank it is to tell it, I know that is just me trying to get me through this situation. Even if it misunderstands the enormity, the intensity of it, that's something very simple inside me. Because remember, this isn't the prefrontal cortex. This is the smarter part of us. It's an emotional, I got this one, get behind me. Thank you. Stand down. I got this one. And so what we're doing is not trying to eliminate it. We're trying to bring it back under our command. It's sort of like taming it, not overpowering it, because that's what you do when this is a liability. It's going to make me look stupid. That's fear. It's thank you. You're trying to protect me. I don't think there's a saber-toothed tiger in the room. Thank you, though, for being so ready to protect me all these years and getting me here. Thank you. I've got this one. Stand down. Very different than trying to eliminate or hide it. And then you'll know at this point already in this process, this calm, breathing, naming, non-judgmental thing that I'm talking about. You'll already feel yourself relaxing, and you'll feel way more in control. And then notice your environment. Wherever you're doing this, and you might have to say, excuse me, I got to go in the other room and label and breathe and do all that. That's totally fine. Then notice your environment. And this sounds sort of futile as well, but it's, what are the colors in this room? How many reflective surfaces are in here? I'm going to count colors. What am I thankful for here? What does this space represent? And to stay there. Don't go back. Don't start fantasizing. The reason we do this is it pulls us back out of the fantasy and puts us where we actually are. So we can feel the gravity of a chair or, on our feet. We feel the air on our skin. It's a very literal, simplistic way of recontextualizing ourselves in reality so we can get out of our head where our brain is trying to spin, like you were talking about, these loops. I'm trying to create that this is something to feel resentful or shame or whatever. Nope. I'm actually in a room with four walls. Dominant color is sort of an off-white. It seems simplistic, but that grafts you to reality again. So that practice, simplistic as it is, gives you some real control, and something that maybe to this point has felt out of your control.
Yeah. No, I think that's super helpful, which I think is probably a good place to, start to land the plane, just from here's some really helpful tips to say, as we're all going to come into those moments, what are some very practical steps that we can be doing here today, this hour, the next hour, that don't take a long time to do, but if we could just walk through steps like that, I think it would, just help us manage and help others manage, that we can help teach them, if we have kids, in simple ways to help teach them, that you don't feel stupid for teaching your kid to count to 10. Like, oh no, that's actually really helpful. And to get yourself out of fantasy zone and back into reality. So I think that's really helpful.
I'll say, good. One other thing I'll say is you're going to immediately, I'm saying in the next 24 hours, we're all going to be faced with this. And you might feel like, I'm just not good at this. I still feel anxiety and tension and all the different ways that we talk about fear. Just be gracious with yourself. Have you seen this Quibi thing? Where it's like movies that are designed to be 5 or 6 minutes. it's some new app. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but I've been seeing advertisements for it. But apparently it's um, so they advertise it like you're stuck in line at the bank. Use Quibi, and it's like you can use Quibi. Like that'll be two Quibis. You know, that means I'm going to watch these two short movies. I don't know who came up with this, but I was watching it, and at first I felt condescension and contempt. But then I was like, that's how afraid of being present we are. That we've found yet another way to fill 6 minutes of being in line. Because heaven forbid we be present and unentertained for 6 minutes. You have to be gracious about that. You have to be gracious about how much we have created a culture that incentivizes escape, of making everything everybody else's fault and not dealing with ourselves. And I'm just using that because right before we went on, I saw an advertisement for that. So you've got to be gracious with these practices because we've been habituated in a very different way. But so health is going to take some time. It's going to take us working together. Don't beat yourself up at this. If you're just starting, then you're not going to be less fearful this year, but it's worth it.
It's a good reminder too, in that graciousness, that boredom can be a good thing, and that
Mm-hmm.
we have trained ourselves in our society. I think there's a lot of parents out there who are feeling the pressure of, I can't let my kids be bored right now, or feel guilty about that, or if you're
Yeah.
bored, something's wrong, and feel guilty about that, and going, no, it helps us learn to be present, and we've got to learn to be present with ourselves, and we've got to learn
Mm-hmm.
some of those disciplines. And so here's hoping that, yeah, you and I can be more gracious with ourselves and the people around us, and uh, yeah, give in less to the ways of patterns of fear. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, thanks for having the conversation.
Yeah, man. It
Always good
was
seeing you.
good seeing you too. Look forward to seeing you in 3 dimensions.
I do the same. All right. Thanks, guys, for hanging out with us. And yeah, we'll talk to you later. See you.